everyone, and welcome to another episode of Alpine Intel's The Savvy Adjuster podcast, where we discuss insurance related topics important to adjusters with the experts who know them best. I'm your host, Sales Operations Manager Chris Nichols. Now, as you might assume, spring and summer are big months for storms, and with them comes reported losses from wind and hail, especially to residential roofs with asphalt shingles, which a lot of you probably have. The volume at which these claims come in, combined with the time it takes to get an expert on site to evaluate the damage, can make these claims sometimes cumbersome for many adjusters. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Now, whether you handle property, auto, liability, or workers' comp insurance claims, you may know, but Alpine Intel is dedicated to helping carriers reach peak performance throughout the policy lifecycle. We're known for leveraging expertise and innovation to make hard things easier and to help solve problems. And that's why I'm very excited to be here today with Alpine Intel's Executive Vice President of Innovation, Chris Scallion, to talk about a new solution from one of Alpine Intel's forensic engineering brands, Donan Engineering, a solution called Donan On Demand. Chris, thank you so much for joining the Savvy Adjuster podcast here today.
I'm happy to be here, Chris.
Well, happy to have you. And before we jump in, we like to remind our listeners that each claim is unique and we speak in general terms here on the podcast. That's why it's so important to get expert conclusions before making any sort of settlement decisions. But Chris, we like to start off our podcast by getting to know a little bit more about our guests. So I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. So I am Chris Scallion, and I lead innovation here at Alpine Intel. But about 15 years ago, I actually started with Donan as a forensic engineer, where I worked in the field and I performed roof inspections firsthand. Later, I moved on to provide the overall technical direction for the engineering group. And over the last few years, I've focused on building robust technology solutions that really transform the services we offer.
Amazing. Well, we as always are in good hands with our guests here today, and let's dive in. So, as I mentioned before, we're talking today about a way to simplify claims related to wind and hail losses to residential asphalt shingle roofs. So, would you mind starting off and maybe giving us an example of one of these types of claims that illustrates issues adjusters may face?
Sure. So I think in a lot of cases, the typical wind or hail claim has a lot of parties involved. You've got the property owner, you've got the adjuster, obviously. Often there's a roofing contractor, and everybody wants that claim to be resolved quickly. But we see a lot of delays just in getting an inspection coordinated or even getting the insured back on the phone sometimes. So coordinating those appointments between multiple parties can be kind of cumbersome. And often we're talking about a part of the property that the adjuster has a lot of experience with. We see tons of roof claims at Donan, and we know that our carrier partners see lots of roof claims as well. So the average adjuster is really experienced with roofing. And sometimes what they just need is a second set of eyes or a validation of an opinion. And it creates a real delay in the claims life cycle, and it drags on that customer experience when you've got to get somebody else on site. So with Donan On Demand, we're able to take those photographs and that typical hail claim, provide that validated engineering opinion without spending 2 weeks coordinating a site study and putting a report together.
Yeah, and you make a good point too, as far as sometimes the toughest thing is just getting maybe an insured on the phone to get their availability of when we can come out, right? There's a lot of parties involved, and maybe during the beginning part of the year where storms aren't as prevalent, that's not a big deal. But when we get to the thick of things, if you will, during storm season, I imagine getting those delays is a little bit more frequent, along with added costs like paying for travel, things like that. So yeah, no, you make a lot of good points as far as some issues that adjusters may face on that. So you touched on Donan On Demand, and so I'm kind of curious, what inspired the creation of the Donan On Demand app, and how does it address or solve some of the pain points that we've heard from adjusters in the past?
Sure. So there's two main benefits to the on-demand claims experience. The first one is time, and the second one is cost. So those are all great things for everybody. Donan Engineering completes about 10,000 roof claims each year. Many of those claims are complex, and having an engineer on site is really valuable. But equally so, a lot of those claims are fairly typical. And when you look at 10,000 a year like Donan does, you can really start to refine the process of the inspection, the investigation, and the reporting. So we found that on a lot of claims, Donan is sending an engineer out. They're coordinating with the insured. They're taking the time to travel out to the site. And then they're just taking the same photographs and doing the same documentation as the adjuster did, or maybe a ladder assist contractor has already done. So we wanted to work on an evolution of our existing desk review process. We created a standalone mobile application that guides the user through photo documentation, and we've built technology integrations into major claim platforms for easy assignment and rapid processing. That mobile application provides the framework so that the engineer on the receiving end is able to look at a property, get a full 360-degree view, and know that they have everything they need to derive an engineering opinion, which they'll complete in an average of about 3 days, which is dramatically faster than our typical on-site engineering investigation. And that all comes in a process we're able to reduce the cost because we're not having to travel that engineer out to the site. The average travel time is about 90 minutes in one direction. And that really adds up in terms of not only the capacity that Donan can offer to serve your needs fast, but also just in the time and the throughput that they can do to move those claims through quickly.
And you touched on getting those very important site photos back through the Donan On Demand app. Can you talk about additional ways that we may be able to receive those photos, whether it's through an integration with other platforms out there?
Sure. So what's really important for us in this is that we really meet each carrier where they are. We want to provide the best tool for your existing process. So for some of our carrier partners, that's that standalone mobile application. Other carriers that are already leveraging things like Cotality Settle Assist or Scope, where they're already following a rigorous process for documentation, we can align the on-demand inputs with that application and enable your field users to essentially walk through the same process without any changes. Um, Anytime that you've already taken photographs of a roof, we want to be able to leverage that for you. And we put a lot of framework in place for our true integrations, but we're also able to provide a desk review in a lot of cases. That mobile application gives us a great framework, especially if you've got a group of adjusters maybe who aren't as familiar with roofs. But the average experienced adjuster already knows everything they need to know. They're already capturing everything they need to capture. And we just want to take that opportunity to review the work that's already been done so that we can avoid something unnecessary for a straightforward claim that's already been documented in great detail, where we can just provide that engineering opinion without traveling out.
Well, and you make a good point too. It sounds like you want to make it as convenient for the carrier partner who is using this as possible. So if they want to use the app, they can use the app. If they're using, like you mentioned, Cotality, Settle Assist, we're good with that either way. So it sounds like there's multiple ways that they can utilize the service, which is great. And you make a good point too with the turnaround time of 3 days is pretty amazing. I can imagine that some of these claims often involve potentially families that are being displaced from their home because of damage, right? And so the quicker, that you can get a report back, the better I would imagine as far as the claim life cycle as well. So,
For sure. I think, part of having a complex claim that requires an engineer just inherently means there's going to be delays. And what's important for us with this solution is that those true delays are only experienced when they're really necessary. So for a lot of claims, whether somebody's displaced out of the house or maybe they're just stressed out because they don't know the status of their roof, they're unsure about the safety of their home. Sometimes these opinions aren't really based in reality, but that doesn't mean that they aren't really real feelings for the homeowner. So if
sure.
we can turn that claim around quickly, we can dramatically boost the experience. And a lot of those delays that we see, they may be scheduling, they may be weather related. Engineering firms are often juggling the same kind of claim volume that the adjuster is. And when you get a rain day in the middle or a snowstorm, that can really throw off the cycle and it just continues to build on those delays, which doesn't leave the insured feeling very good about their situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess my next question too. So, what would a client expect to receive from using Donan On Demand, and how would that compare to if they just submitted for say, a standard on-site assessment?
Sure. So that's really one of the great things about the on-demand solution. What we're really doing here is we're splitting up the data collection process from the reporting process, but that reporting process is the same. The standard Donan Engineering roofing report is incredibly thorough. Our engineers do detailed weather research, they do careful analysis, and they present a standard competent engineering opinion that they're willing to stand behind during a litigation event. Whether we are on site investigating or we're leveraging the on demand solution, that end product, the engineering report is exactly the same. There should be no difference between the two. So everything you get out of a Donan Engineering Roof report right now, you're going to find the exact same thing in the on demand solution.
So, can you give an example of how Donan On Demand has been used, and maybe share some other scenarios in which this process would be a really great fit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the on-demand solution is designed for typical residential roof claims, evaluations of wind damage or hail damage on houses that are less than 5,000 square feet that have asphalt shingles, especially for claims that don't require an interior inspection, but where an expert opinion is needed. Maybe you just need to validate what you're already seeing. We have some adjusters that leverage the solution for anything out of the ordinary, and others that use it on every roof claim where they would typically hire an engineer. And the beauty of this process is that our turnaround time is so rapid. We're talking about an average of 3 days or less, 3 days or less. But really, what we do on that is triage every claim as it comes in, so that if there is a reason that it isn't a fit, we can get somebody out there and we can start that process within 24 hours.
That's perfect. And did you mention, so it's for, just to kind of recap, residential roofs, wind and hail as the stated cause of loss, correct?
That's right.
And then is there a square footage requirement, something that we try to keep this within, for these types of assignments?
Yeah, so we're targeting the typical house, right? And 5,000 square feet is sort of the upper end that we recommend. And that's not necessarily a hard number. And if you're listening, you're probably thinking, well, that's a pretty big house. That's not very typical. And that's true. This process is really flexible. With the photo documentation that we see day to day, we can really do a lot with this process. But there is a limit. So if you're talking about a huge compound with 12 different buildings, or you've got a really elaborate house, probably best to have somebody get out there on site. But like I said, we triage each one of these as we come in. We're going to do our best to serve your needs. And if we recognize that we aren't able to do that through on demand, we'll give you a call and reach out to escalate this out to a local field engineer.
That's great to know that the process doesn't stop. If it doesn't meet the parameters, where it sounds like you're being proactive and getting it into the hands of an engineer and suggesting an on-site at that point, which is fantastic. So, and for those of you listening out there that have a 5,000 square foot house, kudos to you. I am certainly jealous. So the next question is surrounding. I know with Donan Engineering, they do utilize engineering best practices, right? Which is great. So I'm curious, how does the app ensure compliance with those engineering best practices during field inspections?
Certainly. So, like you mentioned, Donan is an engineering company, and that means that they need to meet the legal requirements in every state that we operate, which is all 50 of them. And every engineer has their own professional license that they is really valuable to them, right? That's how they earn their living. And they are going to be incredibly motivated to make sure that they're in line with best practices. So our mobile application includes a self-guided inspection protocol. It walks the user through all the standard documentation. Like I mentioned, this is largely the same process that adjusters and ladder assist contractors follow today. Donan On Demand provides an industry standard engineering evaluation. The report we generate is identical to what we provide after a field inspection. We use a W-2 staff of senior engineers following industry standard practices. They generate an opinion that we are prepared to defend in litigation in every case. The only difference between this product and a traditional inspection is, first, the obvious. The engineer is not present on site. because we are establishing that we have all of the photographs that we need, and then we're turning it around within 3 days. Any complex cases we receive, anything with insufficient information is going to trigger an escalation process. We're going to reach back out to the carrier, we're going to get approval, and we're going to be prepared to send a local field engineer out on site.
It sounds like as a company we're fully able to support it as if it were a standard on-site inspection, which is fantastic to hear. And it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you said is there's a lot of guardrails included in the app to ensure we are getting everything we need and that we're not going back and having to ask for additional photos or clarification. It sounds like the app is intuitive enough and has those guardrails in place to be an easy button and make it easy for the person utilizing it. So
Absolutely. We spent a lot of time on the user experience of using this mobile application. We have planned and executed like rigorous training on how to use the app and how to do a roof inspection. And then in reality, none of it's necessary because the app is totally intuitive and the user already knows what they're doing. It just provides that framework to make sure that we have 100% rather than 99%, gives us that comfort level, provides the support to ensure that 360-degree view is provided to the engineer. And that really takes a lot of the pressure out of process control and allows us to execute so quickly.
it sounds like it. So, our listeners may have questions about whether engineers, and you touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to expand on it, may have questions about whether engineers and their knowledge will still be part of the process. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to remember Alpine is a technology company and we leverage technology to streamline every process we can, certainly within the on-demand process. But this is still an expert-driven report. There's no AI processing photographs or making decisions. There's no magic technology box that is making all this happen. There is a professional engineer licensed in the state of the loss location working on every report providing that engineering opinion that Donan can stand behind.
Well, that's good to know, and you touched on it, but it's probably good for our listeners to know it is a real person on the other side of that report, right? While we do utilize a lot of technology, it is a licensed engineer doing these reviews, which is great to hear. So in what, and again, something you touched on earlier, but would love to expand on it. In what scenarios might an on-site assessment, still be necessary, even with the uses of Donan On Demand?
Yeah, this is not a one size fits all solution, right? There's a variety of engineering services that we offer at Donan and through Alpine. But we encourage our adjusters to submit through on demand first for a few reasons. First, I mean, mainly it's just the speed. We're able to deliver a report so much faster through this solution that really smooths out the claim process. But we have that built-in review and escalation process. So we triage each of these as we come in. And our aim is to reach out within 24 hours if there's something that's obviously not suitable. Sometimes that may be something simple like a critical photograph that's missing. Maybe you had some water on your camera lens and your images are blurry. But it can also be something that just sort of is beyond the norm and really into the complex. So a lot of our Herald claims are relatively straightforward. Every once in a while, there may be something out there that is kind of a head scratcher. So if the engineer has any doubts that they're not able to derive an opinion, they're going to reach out and they're going to get that on-site assessment scheduled. And it's similar for wind damage. A lot of wind claims are straightforward, but there are cases where things happen that are outside of the norm. And that doesn't mean that they're not wind damage or that somebody's not going to be sure about their answer, but there is value in being able to touch and feel it in those complex cases. We just want to make sure that we separate out those truly complex cases from the everyday cases so that we can provide that fast turnaround time when it's appropriate and provide that field engineer resource when that's the best fit.
And I don't have any sort of number, so this is me just guessing right now, but maybe you can validate my assumption is I would imagine a lot of the engineering claims that we do see at Donan fall into the bucket of a perfect fit for Donan On Demand. Is that relatively accurate statement?
You're absolutely right. And that's going to vary by carrier. It's even going to vary by adjuster. But somewhere between 70 to 80% of the roof claims that Donan receives would be a great fit for this. It doesn't mean that all of those will work. There may be some other factors at play in terms of contractors or insureds or property owners, but this is a solution that fits the majority of the assignments that Donan receives. And that's why we built it, because we see such a huge percentage of claims that they're complex from an insurance perspective. But when you look at 10,000 a year, sometimes the complex is becomes Donan's typical. And then it's when it gets really complicated that we really need to have a field engineer on site.
Well, it sounds like for those claims, wind and hail that are to asphalt shingles, Donan's a good place to start. And 75, 80% of the time we'll be able to handle it. The other 20% will move on to a more formalized on-site inspection, which is great. So I'm curious to hear how you see tools like Donan On Demand influencing the future of claims processing and really field inspections in general.
Sure. So I think, the real notable about this solution is just the dramatic speed increase, right? This is so much faster, and it's not for a complex reason. It's just because we don't have to schedule one additional person to drive out to the property. That's where all of the time savings is. Getting the framework and the guardrails in place and the technology solution is also helpful because everything comes in pre-packaged for the engineer to evaluate. But this dramatic speed is sort of a game changer for the industry. And I think that differentiating between those standard claims that can be resolved with a desk review versus those truly complex claims that need an engineer on site is going to become more of an industry practice. There's a lot that we can look at that's already been thoroughly documented by a claims professional. There's also a lot of claims that, really require an additional person out on site. But as we start to split those into two and make those two distinct groups, we're going to see, everything from the everyday standard claim to what's Donan's everyday claim, the sort of complex situation where we can process those really quickly. And then it's those truly outside of the box, the truly complicated solutions where we're going to put engineers out on site.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that question, curious about what advancements in claims processing technology do you anticipate, and maybe how might they build on the foundation set by tools like Donut On Demand?
Yeah, well, like I talked about earlier, right now there's a huge push for AI in everything. And this is not an AI solution deliberately. There is still going to be the requirement that we have an engineer, a trained professional who's doing an evaluation. And I've spent, the last decade looking at a lot of new solutions and new technologies and AI solutions, and they really fall short in terms of, generating a really defensible position that they can't match the licensed professional. What I see that's going to be sort of what advancements are we going to see? It's going to be that technology integration. And that's what we've worked so hard on with Donut On Demand. When we can offer an amazing product, but it's difficult to use, not because it's hard to use, but because the claims process already follows a defined path, it becomes very difficult to adopt that new technology. So what we've worked on with Donut On Demand is building solutions that we can integrate into the adjuster's existing process so that they're actually enabled to leverage them right away without disruptions in training and workflow changes and navigating that kind of back end side of the claim side. We just want to make the tool available, plugged into the technology that you're already using, so you can leverage it right away with limited or no training.
And I think a lot of the service lines at Alpine Intel are built that way as well to help you work claims more effectively, more efficiently, with a higher degree of accuracy, and really helping the adjuster move that through its claim like life cycle, if you will. So, Chris, I really appreciate you joining us on the podcast and taking us through Donan On Demand and really how it can help property adjusters with their residential roofing claims, specifically to hail and wind damage to asphalt shingles. But again, really appreciate the time and thank you for stopping by the podcast here today.
Oh, it was great to be here, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, and if any of the listeners want to learn more, make sure to check out our show notes, and you can also find our Alpine Intel resources library and learn more about our full suite of services at our website. Make sure to bookmark that. It's alpineintel.com. Our goal is always to make sure you have everything you need to make settling claims easier. And of course, our podcast is one way that we support you in that effort. So make sure to subscribe to the Savvy Adjuster podcast so you never miss an episode. And thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.